Yes, a little black square. That is what I have made for you today. We're going to make this. This is a watercolor painting that I did in 3 pieces of paper. And this actually folds flat. Good morning, Heart-Led Artists. We are live and it's another live studio session for the Heart-Led Artists community. I'm Angela Fair and we're going to have some fun painting today. Yes, we are. We're going to have a lot of fun painting today, and I'm really looking forward to the little project I've cooked up for you. It wasn't what I planned to do, and I almost feel like every time I do a live session, I end up doing something a little different than I had planned. That's just the nature of creativity. We start out with an idea in mind and somehow it kicks us into this realm of possibility where new ideas emerge, and I love to chase those new ideas. I really try to always give myself permission to do that. So you can see I'm a little bit Christmassy today. I'm finally starting to catch a little bit of the Christmas spirit, thank goodness. I have my Christmas dog shirt on and 2 shades of green, which I think is kind of fun. So today I just wanted to launch right into our project, and I'm gonna just switch the camera over so you can see what I have made. Yes, a little black square. That is what I have made for you today. We're going to make this. What this is, I'm going to turn it over, is a little Christmas card. This is a watercolor painting that I did in 3 pieces of paper. And this actually folds flat so that you can tuck it into an envelope and mail it as a Christmas card. So I don't even know why, but it just popped into my head that this is something I wanted to try. We're going to paint this today. Are you excited? A little overwhelmed? I'm going to link up in the description after the video the instructions, and they're going to be kind of vague instructions. You'll have to watch the video to follow along because I'm not very good at writing out instructions. But I have this little printout or this little thing that I wrote with just measurements that hopefully will work so that you can make your own if you want to. So I'm going to just demonstrate how I did this and walk you through the steps. And yeah, that's our project for today. I know it's not, we have, we do serious paintings, we do painting development, and then every now and then we really want to take the time to use what we've learned and just have a little bit of fun playing with it. So we're going to just start by cutting out some pieces of paper and prepping that, and I'll put this somewhere where we can see it. The first part is pretty straightforward. You're going to be cutting out 2 pieces of black cardstock. And I'll post measurements so you can see that. What you're really going to be wanting to think about if you're painting along with me today is to have watercolor paper in about 6 by 4 inches. Actually do 6 1/4 by 4 inches for your watercolor paper. And 3 pieces will give you everything you need to do this painting. I'm going to prep the black in a bit, but we're going to just start by getting some of our paintings started. So here I have my backdrop, and this is going to be my little cottage. So we'll have to paint both of those. The backdrop we'll do first because it's going to take a little longer to dry. And the watercolor painting I'm using, or paint I'm using today, is this little kit made by Core. And I like Core paint because it has a nice whoosh to it when you touch it to wet paper. And we need that to paint our Northern Lights sky. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of this yellow. I believe it's like the Nicolazo yellow. I'm actually not sure what it's called in Core brand, but you can see how quickly that just spread across the page. We're going to touch in a little bit of turquoise. And this is like a phthalo blue. I want more than that. And I'm just using a number 10 round brush. It has a nice point to it, so I can use it even for the small details in my cottage. And let's spritz that with some water and get some flow going. Whoosh. I want to add a dark blue, like an indigo. And I think that's what this is. This might be a neutral tint, which would work as well. It's very dark, as you can see, so that's going to give us that night feel. And the more water I use, the more flow. And this is a lot of fun. I can make dozens of these little backgrounds and just explore this idea of painting the northern lights. Like I said, you could spatter with masking fluid and let that dry if you wanted to have stars. I feel like when the northern lights are out, I'm only looking at the northern lights. I'm not really that concerned with stars, but I do want to add a little bit of texture. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt onto this wash. And then as it dries, we'll get a little bit of texture from the salt. And I'm not really concerned with, you know, accuracy here. I really just want this to be a fun little greeting card. And so I want it to be vibrant. I want to have nice flow and some fun texture. And we're seeing that happen here. So I'm going to set that aside to dry, and we're going to work on our cottage. And I had green on my finger, so I've got a little spot right there. Let's turn it around so that will be down on the landscape. And I'm going to start just by sketching a little house so that I have something to paint around. I want my house to have some snow on the roof. I want a straight line for the roof line here, and then a nice curve here. It's a little bit of a whimsical cottage, so I want to show that in the shape of my building here. And I keep touching the dark paint. Now I've got all kinds of spots, so that's great. That gives me that reminder that I get to be a little bit loose with my interpretation. So just a very quick little building. I've made it a little bit larger probably than it needs to be. And I know that I'm also going to be cutting out my cottage once it's dry. I can either cut it out the way I did here and leave some trees in the background, or I could just follow the shape of the building. Depending on how this one turns out, I have a little bit of freedom. I'm just going to soften that to let that little blurb of color just blend into the scene. But what I want to start with actually is that glow of light coming out of the building. I'm going to mist. Let's first put this aside so I don't bump it anymore with my hands. Now, if I was doing this as a series of Christmas cards, I'd probably have several, you know, have half a dozen of those or 10 maybe, and paint a whole bunch at once. But we're just doing one today. So I've misted just a little bit of water right here. I want my yellow, my warm light to flow out from the window. And of course with core, that's easy to do. And that's a beautiful golden glow. I actually think I like a little bit of orange in it though. And there is a, trying to find it here. I think there's a kind of a rust color that might be really pretty to mix with the yellow. I think it's this one right here. I'm just going to make a little puddle in the lid. And the core colors are very vibrant. I only need a tiny bit on my brush to get some rich color going. Mixing in that yellow. And that's a really nice, that looks like lamplight to me, so we'll touch some of that in. And the reason core spreads like this is it has a binder in it called Aquazol, and it's something that core developed, and or Golden actually is the company that makes the core watercolors, and they found this as a proprietary binder. They were developing products and discovered this binder that creates beautiful, rich color that doesn't really fade when you add, once it dries. And you know, those, if you're a watercolorist, you've often been told that watercolor fades as it dries, dries lighter rather. And you know, the core colors don't do that to it's almost indiscernible how much they fade. They really don't. And again, really vibrant violet, way too much. I'm trying to mix a dark violet blue to create some of that night snow and night sky. And I want to be very careful right now as I think about how I paint my landscape, because I know core's tendency to whoosh in there. And I don't want my blue that I'm bringing in right now to take over the painting. So I'm going to add it to the side here, and I'm going to try to use a little less water so that the flow is decreased. There can be lots of water where it's just blue, but right where I start to touch into the yellow, I want to keep a much more controlled amount of moisture. We're going to let this dry, and then we can come in and I'll be able to add more darks and more detail. I'm just going to follow the roof line, and there's dry paper there, so my blue is not flowing into my yellow. And again, this is your opportunity to play with flow and just get that underpainting going on. With painting, I should mention as well where my idea for my cabin has come from. Is that I don't have a photo in front of me, but I did a little Google search when I did my first one, and I just looked at a whole bunch of night cabins and studied how the light flowed out from the windows. Of course, a little night cottage scene is a lovely, there's lots of images that tell that story that you can find just with a quick Google search. And then you can use the multitude of them as your ideas. I don't like to choose one single reference photo if I didn't take it myself. Rather, I look at a bunch and then I improvise from there. So I want to catch, my yellow really has taken over the whole scene. That's that flow of the core colors. And I'm going to have a really nice underpainting with that golden glow. And then once it's dry, I can go in and start to add my darker layers. So I'm totally fine with it just being this kind of foundation right now. There's the dark color, the cool darks in the background, cool darks over here. The light would be radiating out from that window, not to this extent, but because the value of the yellow is quite pale, I can go in later and darken it up and add some dark layers over top and start to place some shadows. And I want to have that warm glow. So I have some options as to where my shadows get placed. So this gets set aside to dry, and we're going to do one more little paint wash. Found my paper here, and this one is to paint our foreground trees. And this is one that's going to be another wet and wet loose wash of color. I'm going to set this aside and spritz my paper just very quickly. The whole thing doesn't have to be soaking wet because I will be adding water as I paint. Back to my yellow again. And then we're going to use some greens. The green I have here in this palette is quite an earthy kind of green, which is kind of nice. But I can also mix green using my same turquoise and that yellow if I want something a little more vibrant. And you can see that's basically, it looks like a phthalo green, which it basically is. It's phthalo blue mixed with yellow. So we've tinted it toward green. And this is just a wash of color as well. And maybe I could add a little bit of darkest darks with that indigo or Payne's or neutral tint or whatever it is. If I had been smart, when I made this little color swatch, I would have written the names beside it. And I'm never quite that organized because I'm always in such a hurry to start painting. It's just who I am. So I'm going to set this aside and let it dry. We're working with small pieces of paper, and so they are curving a bit. You can see I haven't taped them down, and that's fine. I mean, they're just a little piece, and this is just a fun little study. So as this dries, I can start to do my prep for the card. Actually, I'm not going to close the lid because I don't want these petals of color to contaminate the colors on top. So we'll set this aside to dry. This gets set aside to dry, and then our background sky as well. which has been, oh, as it's been sitting, you can see how the salt has created. We actually have stars. Look at that, it's beautiful. So we're gonna set that aside to dry as well. And that means we get to start to move into what I like to think of as crafting. I have a little paper cutter. This has a groove in it, and as I work with the black paper that's going to make up the body of my card, I need to score some tabs so that I can tape it all or glue it all together and have this 3D shape. If you can see that. There's going to be tabs on each end that fasten to each other. And then I also need to cut out this window. So we're going to do that now. So on one side of the card, I'm going to score it at I'm just looking here, at 3/4 of an inch is what my guide is telling me. And so this little paper cutter, I have a little mark there that helps me remember my measurements. And I can use this bone. This is a bone folder, and I bought it to use in picture framing, and I use it actually quite a lot for any time you need to score something or adjust. Yeah, anytime I need to score something. With mat cutting, if I was doing framing, I actually use the bone folder to smooth the edges of the mat after I've cut it. So just so you know what it's used for. It makes a really nice line. So I'm just scoring at, again, one edge wide at 3/4 of an inch and one edge at 1/4 of an inch, which is about the width of this tape that I'm going to be using in a few minutes. And after scoring, I'm going to choose one of these is going to be my window cut. And I've only cut 1/4 of an inch all the way around, which is quite narrow. If you wanted to have a more luxurious feel, you could cut a wider border. Maybe you'd want to size up your paper then. And so I'm going to just cut again at 1/4 inch in from my score marks. And I'm going to make some guidelines here to help me find that. And this tiny little paper cutter is actually going to cut my window for me, which is really handy. I'm just going to use this little cutter. It's got a little arrow here so I can point it at my pencil line and then just slide it down. It's super handy to have this little tool, although my blade gets dull so quickly. And of course, if I didn't have this, I would use an X-Acto knife or a scissor very carefully. Usually we have X-Acto knives, little blades kicking around. We are a family that likes to make things out of paper, so we do always have those kind of tools. So now I've scored a tab on each end of this window piece, and I've scored a tab on each end of my backing piece. So I have the place where I drew my guidelines in pencil. That's the back of the front of my card, the back of the front of my card. And the tabs are going to be opposite each other. So the wide tab on my window is on the right and my narrow tab's on the left. So that means the wide tab here is going to be on the left and the narrow one on the right. And I'm going to put tape, and this is a double-sided tape that I have. A liquid glue would work as well, although you'd want to just save that till you were ready to assemble everything. I'm going to tape it in advance. And I wouldn't be able to consider myself a crafter if I didn't have 4 or 5 different kinds of adhesive always in my house. So double-sided tape works, a liquid glue, glue stick, whatever you want to use. Okay, so I've got the backing there. We're going to put the background on our card first of all. And you know, I painted it just a few minutes ago, so it's still damp. So if I was to use this one, it's really too wet to use, which is a shame because it's beautiful. But I made one in advance so we'd have that on hand. And you can see this one was made with actually with my Daniel Smith colors, and they were a little more diluted, so they've faded quite a bit. But only the top part's going to be visible, so that's the part I'm going to play. The darkest part is the part I'm going to use as my top. And I'm not 100% sure I cut it correctly, so let's just check and see. No, it needs to be a little bit shorter. So I check that before I glue it, and I'm going to just trim about 1/4 inch off. So that's going to get adhered onto the back of my card as my sky. I'm going to put some adhesive on that. And like I said, I have 3 or 4 kinds of adhesive, so I have this giant tape gun, which I'm going to use because I just find it faster than a glue stick and faster than cutting those strips of tape as well, but it's just not quite as sticky. I did brush the salt off first, and if I hadn't, I would have been reminded to do so right now because I'd be feeling that grit. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm assembling is I'm going to make my foreground Christmas trees. And for those, I'm going to use that piece of paper that I painted with a flow of green, and I have a second one here that's actually left over from this card, so we're just going to use that. On the back side of this, this is the correct height. I'm going to draw the tree shapes I want to use. So I need a little bit of space for it to tuck behind the window of the card, so I'm going to do a point of an evergreen tree, and then I'm just going to draw myself a little zigzag. That one's probably going to take a while to cut. I like to do fewer points so it's faster to cut it out. So that one will be easier. And I just drew it on the back so that it makes it really easy to see and to cut without having any pencil marks showing. So I'm curious, and you can mention in the chat, are you a crafter? Do you do paper craft? Do you paint watercolor cards? Do you combine your watercolor love with another creative outlet? I'd love to hear about what you make when you're sitting on the couch or when your table's covered in stuff that isn't watercolor. What that might look like in your house. One of the reasons I have about 40 kinds of adhesive as well is because I did do paper crafting as a business for several years. Often in my Facebook memories I see reminders of hosting scrapbooking events or card making. And that was always a fun way to have friends over and do creative things. And I still have all the paper crafting supplies just tucked away in the shed. It's nice to know you have the right kind of glue when you need it. And of course, if you've waited too long to use it, it's dried up and you don't have it after all. So that's always disappointing. Linda says, I'll try any craft project at least once. Yeah, I agree with that. I used to say everything, but I used to say I love every craft but macrame, and then macrame came back. So I haven't tried it yet, but I guess I shouldn't turn up my nose at anything, because it turns out that macrame can be really beautiful. I didn't know that. I'd love to do, I think it would be amazing to do glass blowing, which I know sounds crazy. So I've got little trees, I've cut them out, and one's going to go on this side just behind the window with a little strip of adhesive, and one's going to go on the other side. So make sure when you cut out your trees that you cut them out so that they're facing opposite directions. I guess one thing you could do is just cut out one tree and then cut it in half. That just occurred to me now. So I'm just putting some of that adhesive on my tree. I know that any part of the tree that has adhesive is going to need to go behind the card. I will have to be very careful, or I don't want to put too much adhesive on the tree. On this one, I'm actually overlapping the adhesive, and then I'm going to fold it backwards so I have a narrower strip. Marie says, I love painting cards for any occasion. For me, the hardest thing about painting cards is just getting the supplies together. I think I would probably do it more if I just had my stuff more accessible, and that's something I should be aware of and actually plan for. So here's my front of my card, with my trees just poking out. I like how it feels now that we're going to be looking into the forest to see our little cottage. But we don't have a cottage yet, so we need to backtrack now for a moment and put these pieces aside and paint the next step on our cottage. Now it's been drying, and I'm trying to decide if I can use it. It's really not quite dry, and I have one that I did in advance, and you can see here how different they are. For this one, I used indigo as my background, and I did a lot less of that glow coming out. So why don't we use this one because it is dry, and then if we have time, we can come back and do another treatment on this one, just so we can compare different treatment. I don't know what I'm talking about. Just so we can compare how each one gets to be a different thing. So I'm going to grab my number 10 round again and take a breath. Look at what I want to do. I want to first paint my cottage just a little bit of brown. And I might just mix that brown with kind of my violety blue, just to give me kind of a more kind of chestnutty color. Chestnut, I don't know if that's right, but. And then I have choked up on my brush. This is a tiny little card, so I need to have a bit of control here as I paint, just following the lines of my roof line. And then I'm going to spread some of that brown out, just lighten it up a bit. The damp brush, just a little bit of water on my brush. And there's a shadow going to be here. The light is coming off of this window and it's supposed to be radiating out. So I need to lose my dark shadows as I come down this way and start to blend this so that it feels like the light is pushing, so that all we see is that golden glow, if that makes sense. And this is where you want to rely on your Google search with your different photos. I need to pay close attention to how, and it's interesting because if you do a Google search on all the different winter cottages with light coming out of the window, what you will see is how much that light can change the scene. In some, the light's just weak and glowing just around the window. In others, it's casting out onto the land and going a long distance. Sometimes they've included a full moon, and so then you also see the light cast from the moon and the shadows from that. So it's a really good opportunity to explore light and shadow on a small scale. And this is why crafting, even a little bit of painting for craft, you're still learning a lot about light and landscape. And so learning never stops just because you're maybe playing a little bit. So I'm going to throw some shadow down on my snow now. And just bring that, if this area is darker and more shadowed, this area is going to feel lighter and more glowing. And I'm going to pull some of that shadow color up below the eaves of the building. And all of this is, again, an experiment. I don't always know, I don't always get it right. And right now I'm not looking at my Google searches at all. So I have to work from the past cards I've painted. I'm gonna put a little shadow on the snow on the roof with my blue. I think it might be an ultramarine or something along those lines. So we get some blue on the roof to cast some snow shadows there. And then I can decide if I want to add more detail to my window. Maybe I'm going to use my tiny brush. This is just a number 4 long round. And I just grabbed the wrong color. I want the brown, maybe a hint of the violet blue that I'd had there. And I can darken my shadow under the eaves of my building. add some panes to my window. I like seeing the corner of the building there, so I've gone a little bit lighter in my shapes. I'm going to just get closer so you can see that just a little bit more. And I'm just not sure how much of the contrast with the blue that I want to have. If we put blue, actually, down here, it might look like shadows, like a bank of snow in front of this glowing light coming off of the building. We can also pull some darks here so the cottage really feels like it's emerging from the dark night. And it's the contrast that really give us that sense of nighttime and light. So I'm going to call that done for today. I wanted to keep it simple. This is a tiny little card, and so, you know, putting in a ton of time trying to refine the details isn't necessarily the best use of my time. And of course, if I was mass producing this, I'd be thinking a lot about trying to get this, the essence of the scene as quickly as possible. One thing I like doing is when you're making multiples of something, I really get to compare what worked well for one and what worked better for another and so forth. I'm going to just create a little bit of an edge that shows snow on the far edge of the roof just by darkening up my background here. And maybe a little bit of a line here as well. I'm going to go to cut this out in just a second, so it's not ideal actually to have a lot of wet paint, but and these are going to be silhouetted winter trees. So I'm going to be cutting out tree shapes from these dark patterns of color. Okay, so the next thing to do would be to cut this to be our middle area of our painting. And ordinarily I would wait for it to dry, but didn't plan that well enough, so that's all right. First I'm just going to come out from here. I'm going to pull up to suggest an evergreen tree maybe in the background. I could keep it really simple. I'm going to try that actually. And I'm going to try to keep my hands clean so I don't put dirty fingerprints on my painting. I should mention that I am a left-handed person using right-handed scissors. That is my greatest skill of achievement. I'm incapable of using left-handed scissors. They just, I don't know how to hold them correctly. And if you're a left-handed person, you might know what I'm talking about. There are never left-handed scissors around when you need them, so there's not much point in learning how to use them anyhow. But you do get blisters after a while if you're using scissors intended for right-handed people and you're using them with your left hand. They're not ergonomically shaped really for your comfort. Okay, so I kind of like that little whimsical pointy triangle trees. It's not really what goes along with this kind of more rustic shape of my cottage, but I just like it, so I'm gonna keep it. And I'm just gonna add one more maybe. Okay, so that's gonna be our middle ground, and I want to double check my sizing because this is important. If I have, I just had a moment of terror. If it's too short, it's going to be very difficult to make it stand out 3D in my scene. So I want to line it up to the score marks on my background paper. So with my pencil, I'm just going to mark, it's going to be pretty narrow. I should have cut this paper just a hair wider. And then this is going to get scored now. And this is about the stage where my entire work surface gets very, very untidy. And it's just, again, it's just what it is. And so I'm lining up to the little groove in my paper cutter so that I can use my bone folder to create that score and fold it. And I'll just fold it back and forth a couple times to give it a little hinge. And you know, that's the nice thing about watercolor paper. It really is so, it's just thick enough that we can, you know, do projects like this without having to go and find craft paper that works for our purpose. The watercolor paper is thick enough that we can create little shapes and fold and score and all of that. Oops. And it's a little bit damp, so it doesn't really want to score very well. It's probably because I'm left-handed. We'll blame that. And again, wanting to score it, which doesn't work very well when it's damp either. And just work at it. And both of the folds need to be going backwards. Actually, it might work for them to go forwards. I haven't really thought it through. So that's going to be our little cottage. So we're going to have that layered onto here and this layered over top, and then we'll be done. So we're on the home stretch. I want to apply my adhesive. If I can find the end of the tape. Now I haven't decided whether the best way to assemble this is to assemble the front and the back and then put the middle in afterwards, or to assemble. I couldn't figure it out, and so we're just gonna have to. I'm just gonna double check that everything's positioned correctly. I've got my back and my front in the order in which they go together. And so we're going to put this guy here. I'm going to try applying him with my butter fingers. I'm going to try applying it right here to this, lining up with the score mark. So it's right about there. And then this piece, I'm going to peel the tape off. And then we're going to stick everything together. I'm going to peel the tape off here. Let's make sure this folds. I didn't test out my folds for the back and the front, which I should have done. It folds nice and neatly. This guy wants to be a little bit crooked, but we'll work it out. I actually applied it to the wrong side. Oh well, it'll work. So this one gets lined up with the score mark on this side. And then we're going to flip it right over. Where's my score here? There we go. So once I flip this, it's going to stick to the tab on this side. I'm starting to see it all come together, folding the score marks on this side. And if I didn't cut my centerpiece very accurately, if it's a tiny bit long, it's not going to sit flat. I might have to remove it and start and try again. We'll see how that is in a minute. And then I just want to apply my last tab to close everything up. And adjusting all of my folds. And the best way to check on this is just to fold it back and forth a little bit. I flatten it this direction, and I'll slide and flatten it this direction. And actually it's holding up pretty well. I thought maybe I'd made it a little bit long. So that is my scene. Now I had an idea just as I was looking at this. One thing I could do is maybe cut some snowdrifts, just cut a piece of white watercolor paper with some little mounds. I could put some sparkle on it, so I'd have a little bit of a snowdrift in the foreground too. That could be fun. We're seeing that little pattern of stars in behind. And I like my little pointy trees. They're a little bit crooked, which gives them kind of a whimsical feel. And we really do feel the light just cascading out of the house. Let's compare it to the other one, just to see how different they can be. And each one gets to be its own thing, which I really enjoy. I notice that this feels less like a sky in the background and more maybe like more of a forest. And that's kind of a fun idea as well. You know, the reason I wanted to create this scene was because I like the idea of creating depth using multiple pieces of paper. And there's actually, when I was searching up the pop-up card idea, there were a lot of tutorials for making shadow boxes with larger scenes and layering paper. And so there's some really beautiful things that artists can do if you like the idea of cutting paper and layering it. In fact, if you want to see layered paper done in a really fine art, artistic kind of way, because this feels a little crafty, and I know that. I don't have a problem with crafts. I love them. I love how accessible they are and how they make it possible for you to invite other people into crafting or creating with you. This is a really good introduction to watercolor for kids or adults who are a little shy about painting. This might be a good way to get them started for the first time, especially because we're playing with wet and wet for the foreground and for the background. As I mentioned, if you want to see this done in a more fine art way, I would suggest looking up Gregory Euclide on Instagram. He is someone who inspires me every time I see how he works with watercolor and different layers of paper in his art. Okay, so you know, another thing you could do with this, which would be really fun, is to actually use a home that you know. Maybe you have a friend who has a cottage. I'm seeing a comment about that in the chat. Adding a little gnome, that's a great idea. Thank you, Lisa. Oh, somebody's asking about how to mail it without crushing. It actually can totally be mailed. If you've cut all your pieces correctly, it will, you can just lean it to the side and that all flattens out. It doesn't hurt it. And then when your recipient receives it, they just straighten out those sides. Okay, so here's the card. Here's what it looks like in assembly. All you need to do is just shift everything over and that will flatten it all out so you can mail it. And the more precise your cuts are, the easier that is to do. I have now 2 more pieces of paper, so I get to make 1 more card after after we wrap up here. Did you want to see me add detail to this one just to see how it turns out? Why don't we do that? So we're going to look for first some dark shadows in the background. We're going to trace around the roof line. Let's see if we can't get it to pop out a little bit. And I'm going to add a lot of water because I don't have to glue this one down right away, so we can continue to encourage flow in the scene. And out behind the cottage, it's very, very dark. That light coming out of the window is going to make the background seem even darker. If you've ever walked with a flashlight, you know what that's like. Everything outside that beam is impossible to see. And then I'm going to use a little water and see if I can create some watermarks in here that will suggest distant trees. Why not? Play with it a little bit. And then in the foreground, we've got our beautiful blue snowbank. And now our brown. So I want to work in the dry spaces. I'm going along the roof line here. There's always a shadow cast from the eaves. And right up to the window, I'm just going to draw that brown down. It's got a little bit of our violet and blue in it. Too much violet, actually. There we go. And over here we see some darks. In fact, the back of the cabin blends right into the dark background behind, where we can't see what's behind the behind the cabin. As a child, I always assumed all the bears were just clustered around behind my grandparents' cabin and just waiting for me to step out. They had a bear show up for Thanksgiving dinner one day when I think I was a baby. And they had Thanksgiving dinner, and as was their tradition, my grandparents lived in a little cabin, literally a little cabin in the woods. And so they went for a after dinner walk, and a bear came up to the house, and I don't know how he managed, but he managed to open the door and go into the house. And he had left again when they came, by the time they came back, but they found his paw prints on the door. And I remember as a child, they didn't wash those paw prints off. They kept them as a souvenir. So I remember seeing these muddy paw prints on the door in my growing up years. And he came into the house and sat in the Thanksgiving pie. So that was always one of those family anecdotes that you would tell every Thanksgiving. So I guess I'm thinking of my grandparents' cabin as I paint this little cottage. Maybe, and maybe I'll have to bring them one for a Christmas present, one of these cards. Put a little snow shadow on this roof line. In fact, we want it to be more shadowed than that, so we get more of a glow yet. I'm gonna push my boundaries a little bit. And one thing you can do when you're painting multiples of something, like we are here, is really give yourself that chance to experiment and to push your boundaries. What does it make the cabin glow more when the roof line is more shadowed? How do we paint that roof line without it blending into the background of the scene? And just each one you can try out different variations and have some fun. Just seeing how those small differences make a big difference. Okay, so that's cabin number, I think we're cabin number 3 now. And this one is interesting because if we compare it to the others, and this is me being a good watercolor teacher again, I can't just craft, I have to teach. And so if we compare it to the others, we just see how they change over time. And notice how this one has a lot more brushwork with it. Let's zoom in a bit so you can see it. Just a little more control, a little more line and detail there. And then this one's been simplified a bit. Notice how the side of it just disappears. And this one feels even softer. And I really love noticing how my style changes as I paint, as I grow more confident with a scene and more willing to experiment and simplify. And usually when I'm painting something many times, I really do start to simplify. I noticed as well, because this is kind of a little bit of a craft project, that I also had to really work to be more refined in my design, so that each time I've made this, I've really worked to be more precise with my cuts and making sure you can see actually this one here is a little wider than the one above because I had to adjust my sizing of everything. So I noticed just as a crafter to become more professional and precise with my cuts, but as a painter to become more soft and loose and let a little bit of that control go. So I just thought that was interesting to notice. Yeah, Linda says I might need to paint a little bear on the one I give them. Yeah, Grandpa would, I'm not sure what Grandpa would think of that. He really, really didn't like bears coming around the yard, especially in later years when they didn't have a dog anymore. So we're going to wrap up for today. Again, I will be posting my instructions and just those measurements to help you out if you're painting one of these. Basically, I mean, it's not super complicated. If you do a lot of paper crafting, you're just adding those tabs onto the edges of your paper so that you have something to glue to. That's the main thing, and keeping your width consistent on all 3 of your paintings so that you have a little bit of extra room to make those tabs so you can adhere it. But this was a lot of fun to make, and hopefully you'll give it a try and have a little fun making a 3D scene of your own. By all means, I give you full permission to go wild with the glitter and get some glittery snow on there. I think that's, of course, always a little bit festive, and there's no such thing as too much when it comes to throwing some sparkle around at this time of year. So thanks for being here with me today. This was a lot of fun to share. This looks like it will be our last painting studio session before the new year. In the new year, we'll be starting a series on, well, I did one lesson just kind of introducing the topic, and we're going to continue that series on painting from a reference photo, composing paintings from reference photos, composing paintings from reference photos that aren't the best, and that will be happening through January and into the new year as a part of our Heart-Led Community Membership subscription. Next week, though, do come back. Artist Carol Carter will be here doing a tutorial for us and talking a little bit about how she coaches herself to growth as a professional artist. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to share with us. She has a very unique and individual style, and it's just going to be a great time of learning from this amazing artist. So thank you for being here today. I hope you're going to post what you make in the community, whether you're inspired by this scene just to paint your own winter cottage, and you can do it on one piece of paper if you want to. That's totally fine. I'd love to see it. Or if you want to make the 3D version, I'd love to see that as well. You can post that in the community to share it with all of us. Thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your day and week. Bye for now.